So unfortunately, we have determined that your play is too good for us here, so we cannot have you play table games anymore.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to another day in my life as an advantaged blackjack player. Today we're back in Minnesota, continuing my Eastern USA road trip. I hope you're all ready for some action because I'll be heading to a high quality double deck game to start things off. In my last video, I hit up Grand Casino Hinckley, Running Aces, Mystic Lake, and Canterbury Park. It was up and down for a while, but right at the end I got a pretty serious $5,000 spanking from Canterbury. In total, I was down $4,860 after those 4 sessions, and this loss brought us down to a measly $91,040 total US profit. Although it's very normal to lose large amounts when you're betting thousands of dollars with a small edge, it still doesn't feel great, so I was hoping to make some of that back today. For anyone new here who's confused, I'm an advantaged blackjack player, and if you want to learn exactly what I'm doing, check out my How to Count Cards video, link is in the description. After I finished getting by Canterbury, I drove 1 hour east to a little casino by the name of Treasure Island. No, not that Treasure Island. This one was in Welch, Minnesota, and they had a nice little 500 max double deck game. Let's hope they hadn't caught word of me from the other casinos that I'd already visited. It's pretty common for casinos in the same general area to communicate with one another, and if so, it can make for a very short session. I got in there and found my table, quickly getting down to work. Here is the bet spread I'll be using. As you can see, I go from table minimum, which is $25 here, up to a maximum of 3 hands of $500. The game conditions here were great and the hourly EV was high. This means there was potential for some good profit. As always, I'll skip through the negative counts and only show the footage that takes place at true 1 or higher. I was about halfway into this first shoe when the count shot up to a true 3. I was playing solo, so I put out one hand of 500. I was dealt a 17 versus 6, which is a stand. Dealer drew to a bust, so this first hand was paid. I threw out the same bet and was dealt a 12 versus 10. I had to take a card and sadly it was a 10. The count dropped slightly to a true 2, and I lowered my bet to $300. I was dealt a soft 16 versus ace, dealer didn't have blackjack, and I turned my hand into a 21. Sweet. Dealer drew all the way to a bust, so this hand worked out. True count was now up to 4, so I bought in a couple $100 to fund my 2 hands of 500. I was dealt a 9 and a 14 versus dealer's 5. This means I was pulling out even more cash to double my 9. I received a 4 for 13, so I was stuck with a couple garbage hands. Sadly, the dealer did not bust, so there goes $1,500. There was no time to mourn my loss because we were now up to a true 5 or higher. I bought in again because I was now raising to 3 hands of 500. I was dealt a soft 15, a 20, and a 17 versus dealer's 3. I turned the soft 15 into a 13 and stood. I debated for a second on whether I should split the 10s and decided that the count was there. This is a deviation that occurs at a true count of 8 or higher. I always play using perfect basic strategy, but will often deviate when the count is at certain levels to gain even more of an advantage. I turned my 20 into 2 hands of 12 and stood both, which is a deviation that occurs at true 3. It's all on the dealer now. Well, dealer's 19 wiped out all 4 of my hands and I was down another $2,000. All the right moves were made, the cards just didn't fall my way this time. All I could do was get into another shoe and wait for the count to go positive again. About half a deck into this next shoe, we hit a true 1. I raised my bet to $100 and received a soft 15 versus 7. I turned it into a 20, which was enough to beat the dealer. I played one hand at minimum bet, which brought the count up to a true 3. Out went the $500 bet. I was dealt a 15 versus ace, and I didn't take insurance here because the count had dropped below a true 3. Dealer didn't have it, but sadly I turned my 15 into a 23. I tried again, getting dealt a 19 versus 8. I stood and dealer flipped a 9, which was good news for me. I dropped my bet to $300 and was dealt a 12 versus 2. True count must have been back up to 3 because I stood. It worked out this time because the dealer drew to 23. All those small cards brought the count up to a true 4. Time for the 2 hands of 500. I put him out there and was dealt a 16 and soft 15 versus 2. I stood the 16, turned the soft 15 into a hard one, and prayed for the dealer bust. He scared me for a second, but ended up drawing all the way to 23 again. Hooray! Both my hands were paid, and I pulled my bets back because that was the last hand of the shoe. Let's just take a moment to appreciate this guy's shuffling technique. It was one of the best I'd ever seen, making this game almost as quick as an auto-shuffled game. You gotta love it. After this, I played through 2 shoes that were completely negative, meaning I didn't raise my bet at all from table minimum. Finally, we caught a hot shoe, and before I knew it, the count had risen to a true 2. I put out my $300 bet and was dealt a 13 versus 10. I turned it into a 16 and stood, which is a deviation. It was no use because the dealer had a 10 underneath. I tried again with the same bet, receiving a 14 versus 10. I turned it into a 17, which wasn't enough to beat the dealer's 19. My next hand was dealt a pair of 9s versus 10. I stood, and once again the dealer made a hand. The count dropped to true 1, so I lowered my bet to $100. I was dealt a 15 versus 10, turned it into a 17, and lost again. My next hand of 100 was another 17, and finally the dealer busted. After this, I was back to minimum bet for a while, until a huge cluster of small cards came out, bringing the count to a true 5 or higher. I casually upped my bet from $25 to 3 hands of 500, nothing to see here, and was dealt a 12, 8, and 14 versus ace. I forked up $750 of insurance money for all 3 hands. Let's hope the dealer has blackjack. She did not, which means I was down another $750 and was gonna have to play these garbage hands. I turned the 12 into a 20, the 8 into a 17, and the 14 into a 24. Dealer showed no mercy, drawing to 21 and wiping out my other 2 hands. Lovely. I bought in for $1,500 to fund another 3 hands of 500. I was dealt a 9, 19, and a soft 14 versus dealer's 7. 9 will double versus 7 at true 3 or higher, so I did just that, turning it into a 13. I stood the 19 and turned the 14 into a 21, so that was nice at least. Dealer had 10 underneath, so I broke even on this hand. For the last hand of the shoe, I fired off another 3 hands of 500. I received a 20, 15, and another 20 versus 10. I stood all 3 hands, deviating for the 15, and of course the dealer had a 10 underneath. As I said, that was the last hand of the shoe, and we weren't looking too good so far. Feels pretty lame to see such garbage hands come out in the high counts, but taking L's like this is all part of the job. The only way to make anything back is to keep going, so I got into a new shoe, which started to go positive right near the end. The count hit a true 1, so I upped my bet to $100. I was dealt a 10 versus ace, which I turned into a successful 21. All those low cards skyrocketed the count to true 5 or higher, so once again the 3 hands of 500 were coming out. I was dealt a 10 and 2 18s versus dealer's ace. This means I was buying insurance again, which was all for nothing because the dealer didn't have blackjack. I pulled out some cash to double my 10, which is a deviation that occurs at true 3 or higher. I turned it into a 17, so all I could hope for was a dealer bust at this point. And of course, she flipped a 9. As I watched my $2,000 get wiped off the table, all I could do is hope that this session turned around. Some days it just feels impossible to win, and this was one of them. The next shoe was uneventful until right at the end where the count hit a true 3. I raised to 1 hand of 500, was dealt a 9 versus 10, and proceeded to bust it out. That was the only positive count of this shoe, so let's jump to the next. Here we hit a true 1 and I was dealt a 15 versus 9. Of course, on the tiny bet I pull a 6 for 21, why can't I get this luck on the big hands? My next hand was dealt a 14 versus 10, and again I draw to 21, like come on. The cards are just taunting me at this point. True count went up to 2, so I raised my bet to $300. I ended up with an 18 versus 9, and of course the dealer had a 10 underneath. What a cruel world. That was the last positive hand of the shoe, so let's fast forward. The next shoe was negative until right near the end when the count jumped up to true 3. Out went the hand of $500 and I was dealt a soft 16 versus 10. I turned it into an 18 and for once the dealer didn't have a 10 underneath. This hand was actually paid. I dropped my bet to $300, getting dealt a 20. Dealer also had 20, so we pushed. This was the last positive count of the shoe, but we quickly got back to true 1 in the next. My $100 bet was dealt a 12 versus 3. True count was now up to 2, so I deviated and stood. Dealer drew to 18, so this one was no good. By the end of this hand, the count had shot up to a true 4, so I raised to 2 hands of 500. I was dealt a 17 and 15 versus 6, nothing to do but stand and hope for the dealer bust. Unfortunately, that just didn't seem possible today as the dealer drew to 18. It's almost laughable how bad this game can treat you at times. At this point I was buying in again because the true count was 5 or higher and I needed $1,500 to play with.
Check at 500.
But we'll have to ask. We'll have to ask if you have your social security number. Your identification.
I'm from Canada, but I can give you my passport. I don't have a social. But this, it'll have all the stuff. And then if you need anything else, just let me know.
So what you guys just saw was them asking for my ID to do a CTR, aka a currency transaction report. Anytime more than $10,000 has been exchanged between two parties, the government requires that one of these forms be filled out. Whether I'm buying in or cashing out, if it's over $10,000 it has to be done and I have to hand over my ID. I have heard stories of people getting past the CTR without handing ID over, but I'm certain it's a very long and annoying process, so I just hand over my ID. Once I got my 3 hands of 500 out, I was dealt 18, 8, and 14 versus dealer's 10, of course. I ended up with 2 18s and a 17, and for once the dealer remembered how to bust. Let's hope we can get a few more hands like that before they search my name up in their databases, which is usually what happens when I CTR. My next 3 hands of 500 were dealt 13, 14, and Blackjack. Dealer was showing 9, and my Blackjack was paid $750. I then proceeded to turn the 13 into a 21 and the 14 into a 24, so at least one of these hands had a chance. Dealer drew to a bust, so we made a bit of money on this hand. True count was staying strong at 5 or higher, and my next 3 hands were dealt a 20, Blackjack, and 10 versus dealer's 10. Finally, some decent hands. Once again, my Blackjack was paid $750, I stood the 20, and true count must have dipped below 4 because I didn't double the 10. At least I turned it into a 20. Of course the dealer had a 10 underneath, so both of these hands pushed. Better than losing, but still, it would have been nice to make a bit more back. I got into a new shoe and before long the count hit a true 3. I was no longer playing solo, so out went 2 hands of 300. I received a 16 and an 18 versus 8. The 16 became a 26 and the 18 ended up pushing. On my next 2 hands of 300, I was dealt a 15 and 17 versus 10. The 15 became a 25 and the 17 was a loss after the dealer flipped an 8. The count dipped below true 1 for one hand before recovering to a true 2. I was dealt a pair of 17s versus 10, stood on both, and luckily the dealer drew to a bust. Once again the count dipped back into the negatives where it stayed for the rest of the shoe. In the meantime, I filled out the CTR paperwork, they got me a player's card with some meal credits on it, and I waited out the rest of the shoe. Once I got into a new one, the count eventually made it back to true 2. I was dealt a 20 and 16 versus ace, I stood the 20 and busted out on the 16. Dealer drew to f***ing 21, so my first hand also lost. No more positive counts for this shoe, so let's fast forward to the next. The count made it back to true 1, so out went $100. I was dealt 19 versus 6, which ended up being successful. My next hand was dealt 7 versus 3, which was not as successful. All those small cards brought us to a true 5 or higher, so out went the 3 hands of 500. Right as this happened, they did a dealer change, so we burned a card only to reveal the cut card. This meant the shoe was over and is super annoying because it's not too often that the count is so high. Although with how this session was going, this probably ended up saving me money. Back to minimum bet I went, and I stayed there for a couple shoes until finally my time was up.
If we can step back to that. So unfortunately, we have determined that your play is too good for us here at Treasure Island, so we cannot have you play table games anymore.
Okay.
Since you did provide ID, you can use anything else. You can play slots. You just can't play table games anymore.
Okay.
Okay? Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Even though I was down many thousands, these guys weren't willing to risk me getting it back. No more blackjack for me, so that means I was gonna have to make my money back elsewhere. As I said, this was a very high EV game. We saw tons of high counts, but just experienced some bad variance. All in all, I played for 1 hour and 34 minutes. My hourly EV was $690, and I was leaving with a loss of $7,215. Not the intended result, but I couldn't have done anything differently. After this, I called it a night, came back in the morning to use up my meal credits on some steak fajitas, and then hit the road. Thanks to those fajitas, the 7K loss didn't hurt as bad. I had a 3-hour drive across state lines ahead of me, which brought me to my next spot called Ho Chunk in Baraboo, Wisconsin. I was after their high-limit 6-deck game, which would allow me to use my $1,000 max bet spread. However, once I got in there and found out I couldn't add a hand mid-shoe, this game became much less appealing. The table minimum was $25, but if I wanted to play 2 hands, I had to double the table minimum on each, so my minimum bet would have to be 2 hands of 50. This is okay in some cases, but the deck penetration here was pretty garbage and I decided it was a no-go. Luckily, there was a $15 game on the main floor with a $500 max, so I was gonna have to be okay with that. Conditions were better than high limit, and I could add a hand mid-shoe, so this was a no-brainer. This will be my bet spread for the game here. They didn't allow 3 hands, so I was going to be maxing out at 2 hands of 500. I played a couple shoes in the negative before I finally got a single bet at true 2. I was solo, so I put out a hand of 300. I was dealt a soft 18 versus 7, stood, and the dealer flipped a 10. Nice. After this, I was back to minimum bets for the rest of the shoe. Eventually we hit a true 1 in the next shoe, so I raised my bet to $100. I was dealt a 13 versus 10, which I busted on. I played a hand at minimum bet before the count returned to true 1, so I tried again. I received a 17, dealer was showing 10, and ended up flipping a 9. After this, the count retreated to the negatives for the rest of the shoe, so let's move on. Sometime later, I found myself buying in to fund 2 hands of 300, so the count must have been true 3. I was dealt 5 and 15 versus 10. I turned the 5 into an 18 and the 15 into a 19. Sadly, dealer had a 9 underneath, so no money was made on this hand. I tried again, this time with 2 hands of 500, and was dealt a 19 and soft 14 versus 9. Of course, I stood the 19 and turned the 14 into a 26. There goes all the aces. Dealer flipped another ace for 20, so both these hands were a failure. The shoe ended shortly after this with no more positive counts. In a later shoe, we made it back to true 1. I put out a big stack of red and was given a pair of 9s versus 5. Time to split. They became a hand of 17 and 16 and all I could do was stay. Dealer ended up drawing to a bust, so I was paid. True count was now 2, so I raised to 2 hands of 200. I was dealt a 19 and 10 versus 10. I stood the 19 and turned the 10 into a 20. Once again, the dealer drew to a bust. I think this is the first time I've won 2 hands in a row this entire video. The true count must have been somewhere between 1 and 2 because I dropped to a single hand of 200. I was dealt 15 versus 10, and sadly this one didn't end so well. I played 1 hand at true 1, which ended up being successful before the count recovered to a true 3. There was hope because I was dealt an 18 and 15 versus 3. Unfortunately, my hope was crushed because the dealer drew to 20. After this, there was another streak of negative counts, but eventually we got back to true 1. I ended up with a 19 versus 10, but I was no match for the dealer's 20. My next hand was dealt 20 versus 6. You'd think this would be a win, but we ended up pushing. The losing continued on the next hand with the dealer getting a blackjack. I played 1 hand of minimum bet before the count made it back to true 1. I lost 1 and won the next, and this brought us to true 2. Out went the 2 hands of 200. I was dealt a 13 and a pair of aces versus dealer's 10. The 13 became a 20 and the aces became a hand of 14 and 21. Dealer flipped a 10, so this was a break-even hand. I dropped to $100 and lost my next hand. The hand after that was an ace split, which I ended up breaking even on. This brought the count back into the negatives, where it stayed for the rest of the shoe. Once again, I played a couple shoes in the negative. The deck pen here wasn't great, and that meant a lot of shoes went to waste. After a while, we were back to the big ol' stack of reds. I was dealt 11 versus 3, which means it was time for a double. I turned it into a 14, and just to rub it in, the dealer drew to 21. True count was now 2, and since I was back to playing solo, I raised to one hand of 300. I was dealt 20 versus 5, and amazingly, I actually got paid. My success was short-lived, however, because my next hand of 20 was beaten by a dealer blackjack. I dropped my bet to $100 and was dealt a 12 versus 7. I turned it into a 19, which was good enough for a win. My next hand was dealt 16 versus ace, which I promptly turned into a 26. After this, we were back into the negatives for the rest of the shoe. Before too long, we were back to true 1, so out went the $100 bet. I was dealt a 20 versus 10, and that ended up being a win. I played a few hands at minimum bet before the count made it back to true 1. This one was no good, but it brought the count up to true 2. My two hands of 200 were dealt a 13 and 19, dealer was showing 6, so I stood on both. Of course, the dealer didn't bust, and I broke even on this hand. My next hand was pretty similar, getting dealt a 14 and 19, this time versus dealer's 8. I turned the 14 into a 17, expecting to break even again, but the dealer flipped an ace, meaning I was left with a push and a loss. That was the last hand of the shoe, and after this I went quite a while without raising my bets. At this point in the session, I hadn't caught a great shoe yet, just small opportunities to raise my bet here and there, but that was about to change. Several shoes later, I had another stack of red out. This means the count was true 1, and I ended up winning this hand. I tried again with the same bet and was successful once again. After this, the count had risen to true 2, so I upped my bet to $300. I was dealt 13 versus 3, which wasn't enough to beat the dealer's 18. My next hand was almost identical, 13 versus 2, and once again the dealer came out ahead. Let's try this again. Finally, a 20. But would you look at that, dealer drew to 21. Today was just not my day. True count was still 2, and my next hand was dealt a 17 versus 9. Once again, dealer smoked me. I was a bit excited to see my next hand get dealt a 20, but again, the dealer found a way to keep me from winning. The true count was now somewhere between 2 and 3, so I raised my bet to $400. I was dealt 14 versus 10, which I turned into a 19. Dealer drew to 17, so finally some chips moved in my direction. The count was now up to a solid 3, so out went the $500 bet. I received a 12 versus 10, which I turned into an 18. I stood, and you can guess what happened next. I fired off another hand of 500, getting dealt an 18 versus 4. All I could do was stay, and amazingly, the dealer drew to 17. No celebrating though, because my next hand of the same bet was beaten by a dealer 21. True count was still staying strong at 3, so I kept my bet the same. I was dealt 14 versus ace, and this means it was time to buy some insurance. The dealer didn't have it, so there goes my $250. The 14 became a 16, which I stood on. This is a deviation that occurs at true 3 or higher. Dealer had a 7 underneath, so there goes my $500. Finally, the count jumped up a bit, reaching a true 4. I put out two hands of 500 and was dealt a soft 19 and a 6 versus dealer's 9. I stood the 19 and turned the 6 into a 17. Much to my dissatisfaction, the dealer drew to 21. Yikes. I was not having a very good time here at Ho Chunk, especially after the session I had just came from the night before. I bought in and tried again with another two hands of 500. I received an 8 and a 17 versus 6. Out came the cash again because 8 doubles versus 6 at a true 2 or higher. The doubles were not hitting today, and this 8 became a 12. It'd be nice if the dealer could just bust, but nope, he drew to 19, which was no good for me. This is where I found out I couldn't play 3 hands. I tried to put him out, but the dealer said it was a no-go, so I was stuck with my 2 hands of 500. I was dealt an 11 and a 19 versus ace. I threw out my $500 of insurance money, and for once it actually worked. So that was nice. I'm trying to get paid though, so it would be cool if the dealer stopped getting 21 and blackjack every other hand. My next 2 hands of 500 were dealt 12 and 20 versus ace. You know what this means, insurance. No dice this time around, and I turned my 12 into a 17. Dealer had a 9 underneath, so I lost one and pushed the other. Great. True count wasn't budging, so neither did my bet. I was dealt a soft 16 and 20 versus 4, so I pulled out some cash to double the 16. I turned it into a hard 16, stood the 20, and dealer drew to f***ing 20. You can't make this shit up. If I was a normal gambler, I'd never play this game again. I'd think it's rigged, but sadly this happens quite often, and the only way you beat this game as an advantage player is over hundreds of thousands of hands. I try not to let it faze me, but it never feels nice to lose. Regardless, there's only one thing to do during a positive count, so out went another 2 hands of 500. I was dealt a 10 and 20 versus ace, bought insurance, and dealer ended up having it. What a waste of 2 great hands. I tried again, getting dealt a 14 and 17 versus 3. Nothing to do but stay and pray, which was not successful. Dealer drew to 20 once again. The count was still sky high and I wasn't pulling back. My next 2 hands of 500 were dealt 9 and 12 versus 8. The 9 became a 19 and the 12 became a 22, unsurprisingly. For once the dealer actually busted, so this was a break-even hand. My next hands were dealt soft 18 and 14 versus 2. I doubled the soft 18, turning it into a 15. I didn't have much faith in this one, but luckily the dealer busted again. After this, I was dealt a pair of 19s versus 10. Something must be up because once again the dealer busted. For the last hand of the shoe, I was dealt a pair of 17s versus 10. All good things must come to an end as the dealer flipped a 10. There ain't no way around it, that shoe was brutal. Thank goodness it happened on a 500 max table. It would have been twice as bad on my full bet spread. Once again I ended up CTRing, so I had to give ID and fill out paperwork. I played for a while after this, but didn't see any more positive counts. Eventually they closed some of the other tables, meaning the couple that remained filled up and the game speed took a nosedive. At this point I just decided to call it a night. It was late and the EV here just wasn't good enough to justify staying. After 3 hours and 35 minutes, I packed it up and left. My average hourly EV was $205 and I was leaving with a loss of $7,790. Oof. The total loss between the 2 sessions in this video was $15,005. Not what we were hoping for. It's not the first time and it won't be the last, but this certainly doesn't feel great. It should be illegal for a shoe to go that bad. This session took place many months ago at this point, but it's still frustrating to look back on it and see how bad it was. One thing's for certain, it always helps to sleep it off, so that's exactly what I intended to do. Come morning time, I was headed further east towards Milwaukee. Hopefully I can make a good chunk of this back in the next video. That's all I got for you guys today. I wish it had gone better, but this is just the reality of playing advantage blackjack. You're gonna get your ass whooped sometimes. All you can do is keep grinding and getting that time in, and if you do, you're likely to continue being profitable. Thank you everyone for watching. I'll see you all in the next video. Peace.